Vietnam, May 2, 1968. The sun had barely risen, but the jungle was already alive with gunfire. The air was thick with smoke, the cries of wounded men, and the deafening roar of machine guns echoing through the valley. Deep inside enemy territory, a 12-man Special Forces patrol was trapped. Surrounded by hundreds of North Vietnamese soldiers, their only hope was a miracle. The radio crackled with desperate calls for extraction, but every helicopter that approached was met with a storm of bullets. On one of those helicopters stood a man who had no orders to be there. He carried no rifle, no helmet, no plan to return alive. Just a medical bag, a knife, and an unshakable resolve. His name was Roy Benavidez. As the chopper hovered over the kill zone, Benavidez crossed himself and whispered a prayer. Then, without hesitation, he jumped into the heart of hell. It was the beginning of 6 hours that would defy every limit of human endurance. A battle where one man would carry an entire team on his shoulders, bleeding, broken, but unyielding. That day, Roy Benavidez would become more than a soldier. He would become a legend. Before he became a legend on the battlefield, Roy Benavidez was just a boy from the dusty fields of Texas. Born in 1935 to a poor Mexican-American family in Cuero, life gave him no favors. His parents were farm workers, struggling to make ends meet during the harsh years of the Depression. When Roy was only a child, tragedy struck. First, his father died of tuberculosis, and then, just a few years later, his mother passed away too. Orphaned before his teenage years, Roy and his brother were sent to live with extended family. The house was crowded, money was scarce, and every day felt like another test of survival. He wore second-hand clothes, often went barefoot, and worked in cotton fields to help put food on the table. School was never easy. As a Mexican-American kid in the segregated South, he was often mocked, dismissed, and underestimated. But Roy was stubborn. He refused to give in. He built his body through farm labor and football, but even more, he built a spirit hardened by loss and fueled by resilience. Every hardship was molding him for the man he would one day become. The fields of Texas taught him grit. Poverty taught him humility. And losing his parents taught him that life could take everything away, except your will to fight. In 1952, at just 17 years old, Roy Benavidez dropped out of school and enlisted in the Texas Army National Guard. For him, the Army wasn't just about patriotism, it was a way out, a path to escape poverty, to find structure, and to prove himself in a world that had written him off. By 1955, he had transferred into the active-duty U.S. Army. Roy dreamed of something bigger, becoming a Green Beret, one of the elite soldiers of the Special Forces. But dreams don't come easy. During his early service, he deployed to South Vietnam. There, in 1965, tragedy struck. While on a patrol, Roy stepped on a landmine. The explosion didn't kill him, but it left him with devastating injuries to his spine. Doctors told him he would never walk again. For months, he lay in a hospital bed, paralyzed from the waist down. The Army was preparing his medical discharge. His brothers in arms moved on, and it seemed like the young soldier's career and his dream had ended before it even began. But Roy Benavidez was not the type of man to accept defeat. Every night after the lights went out, he would drag himself out of bed and, using only his elbows, crawl across the hospital floor. He did this in secret, fighting through excruciating pain, determined to prove the doctors wrong. Little by little, against all odds, sensation returned. Step by painful step, he learned to walk again. After more than a year of relentless struggle, Roy stunned the medical staff. Not only was he walking, he was determined to rejoin the Army as a fully fit soldier. It was the first time Roy Benavidez cheated fate, but it would not be the last. After defying the doctors and regaining the ability to walk, Roy Benavidez wasn't satisfied with simply returning to duty. He wanted to test himself at the highest level. He applied for the U.S. Army Special Forces, the Green Berets. The training was brutal. Candidates were pushed to the limits of endurance, discipline, and willpower. Many stronger and healthier men quit along the way, but Roy had already survived something far more punishing than the obstacle courses, the landmine and the hospital bed that had nearly ended his life. Compared to that, no trial seemed insurmountable. Through sheer grit, he earned the coveted Green Beret. For Roy, it wasn't just a patch on his shoulder, it was proof. Proof that he had overcome the impossible and that he belonged among America's most elite warriors. By 1968, the Vietnam War had reached its bloodiest years. The jungles were unforgiving, the enemy relentless. Roy deployed once more, this time not as a young soldier uncertain of his path, but as a Special Forces staff sergeant, fully prepared for whatever fate might bring. He carried into battle not just weapons and gear, but the scars of his past, and the unshakable belief that no man should be left behind. And it was in those jungles of Vietnam that Roy Benavidez would face the ultimate test of his life. A test that would push him beyond the limits of flesh and bone, into the realm of legend. May 2, 1968, the Vietnam War was raging in full force. Deep in the Cambodian jungle, a 12-man Special Forces team, known as a MACV-SOGI unit, found themselves in desperate trouble. They had been dropped behind enemy lines to gather intelligence, but the mission quickly turned into a nightmare. Surrounded by hundreds of North Vietnamese soldiers, they were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. Radio calls crackled with panic. "We need extraction now." Back at the forward operating base, Roy Benavidez heard the distress calls. He wasn't part of the mission. He wasn't supposed to be in that helicopter. But when he realized his brothers were about to be overrun, he grabbed a knife, his medical bag, and an M16, and sprinted to the rescue chopper. As the helicopter lifted off, Roy knew the odds. A dozen Americans trapped, surrounded by hundreds of enemy troops, pinned down with no chance of escape. Most men would have seen it as a suicide mission, but for Roy Benavidez, there was no hesitation. No man left behind wasn't just a motto, it was a sacred oath, and in the next 6 hours that oath would transform him from soldier to legend. The helicopter carrying Roy swooped down over the kill zone. Enemy gunfire shredded the air, tracer rounds cutting across the sky. As soon as the chopper reached the ground, Roy jumped out, straight into the jungle with nothing but his rifle, a knife, and his determination. Almost instantly, enemy bullets tore into him. He was hit in the face, the arm, and the leg. Most men would have fallen right there. But Roy kept moving forward, sprinting through gunfire until he reached the trapped Special Forces team. He immediately went to work. First aid under fire, pulling the wounded to cover, firing his weapon to hold back the enemy. The jungle was chaos. Screams of pain, explosions, gunfire from every direction. But in the middle of it all, Roy Benavidez became a one-man lifeline. He wasn't thinking about survival. He wasn't even thinking about himself. Every thought, every ounce of strength was focused on one mission: get his brothers out alive. And this was just the beginning of 6 hours of pure hell. Despite his wounds, Roy didn't stop. He organized the defense, moving from man to man, giving orders, patching wounds, and returning fire. Bullets sliced through the jungle. Grenades exploded around them. But Roy was everywhere at once, dragging men to safety, resupplying ammunition, calling in airstrikes. At one point, enemy soldiers broke through the perimeter. Roy jumped into the fight with nothing but a knife, taking them on hand to protect the wounded. His body was being torn apart. Shrapnel, bullets, bayonets. But he refused to fall. Helicopters tried to land for evacuation, only to be shot down or forced away by the sheer intensity of the enemy assault. The situation was desperate, but Roy wouldn't let go. For every man who thought about giving up, Roy's voice was there, steady and unbreakable. "We're getting out of here. Stay with me." For 6 brutal hours, under relentless fire, Roy Benavidez turned chaos into survival. He wasn't just fighting the enemy. He was fighting against time, against pain, against death itself. As the sun began to set over the bloody jungle, Evacuation helicopters fought desperately to break through enemy fire. Smoke and chaos filled the clearing, and Roy, bleeding from head to toe, refused to leave until every last man was pulled aboard. When the first chopper was hit and spun out of control, Roy sprinted through gunfire to rescue the crew, dragging them back under cover. With the next attempt, he carried man after man to the landing zone, shielding them with his own body. Each trip back into the firefight felt like a death sentence, but he would not stop. Finally, when the last wounded man was aboard, Roy collapsed into the helicopter, his body shredded by shrapnel bullets and bayonet wounds. He had 37 separate injuries. Medics thought he was dead and prepared to put him in a body bag, until he spit in their faces to prove he was still alive. Against every odd, Roy Benavidez had endured. He had gone into the jungle to save his brothers, and he brought them back. Roy Benavidez was taken to a field hospital, broken in every way imaginable. Doctors counted 7 gunshot wounds, multiple shrapnel injuries, bayonet slashes, and his jaw shattered. He had lost so much blood that he was given up for dead, more than once. Yet Roy refused to die. Months of surgeries followed, then grueling rehabilitation. He learned to walk again, step by painful step. Against every prognosis, he not only survived but returned to active duty, determined to continue serving the country that he nearly gave his life for. For years, his actions in that jungle were known only to the men he saved. Official reports were delayed, testimonies lost in the fog of war. It wasn't until 1981, nearly 13 years after that fateful day, that Roy Benavidez stood in front of President Ronald Reagan at the White House. Reagan called the story of Roy's heroism so incredible that, if it were a Hollywood script, no one would believe it. And then, with the nation watching, Roy Benavidez was awarded the Medal of Honor. It was more than a medal. It was recognition that, in the darkest corners of war, one man's courage and loyalty had changed the fate of dozens. After receiving the Medal of Honor, Roy Benavidez could have lived quietly, letting his story fade into history. But Roy believed his survival meant he had another mission: to fight for those who had no voice. He traveled across the United States, speaking to schools, military academies, and veterans organizations. His speeches were not polished or rehearsed. They were raw, honest, and filled with the same intensity that carried him through that jungle in Vietnam. Roy spoke openly about sacrifice, about loyalty, and about the price of freedom. He reminded young people that courage wasn't only found on the battlefield. It was found in classrooms, in families, and in communities that stood together. But he also spoke about the darker truths. He advocated fiercely for better treatment of veterans, many of whom returned from Vietnam to face neglect, indifference, or even hostility. He argued that the real battle for many soldiers began when they came home. For countless veterans, Roy Benavidez was more than a war hero. He was proof that resilience was possible, that scars could carry meaning, and that no sacrifice should be forgotten. Roy Benavidez lived long after that fateful day in Vietnam, but the wounds he carried never truly healed. His body remained a battlefield. Constant pain, surgeries, and hospital visits became part of his life. Yet, despite it all, he never stopped serving others. On November 29, 1998, Roy Benavidez passed away at the age of 63. He was laid to rest with full military honors at Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery in San Antonio, Texas. Soldiers, veterans, and families gathered to pay tribute to the man who had done the impossible and lived to tell about it. But Roy's story did not end at his grave. Schools, buildings, highways, and even military facilities now carry his name. His Medal of Honor citation is studied by soldiers as a testament to courage under impossible odds. Perhaps his greatest legacy lies not just in the medals or the speeches, but in the reminder he left behind that true valor comes from selfless service. Roy himself once said, "A lot of people call me a hero, but the real heroes are the ones who gave their lives for this country. I only did what I had to do." Today, his story continues to inspire not just soldiers, but anyone facing overwhelming odds. Roy Benavidez remains proof that even when the world writes you off, your spirit can rewrite history.